Something was right in front of you this whole time, but no one wanted you to notice. Have you ever felt that something is wrong with the world, like a part of reality is being hidden from you? Not in a dramatic or paranoid way, but as a quiet, persistent feeling. As if something essential was missing from the picture you were given. Maybe you've even passed right by it and didn't notice. Or maybe you noticed it for a brief second and then dismissed it, telling yourself it was nothing, that you were overthinking. That moment when everything felt strangely clear, and then life quickly pulled you back into noise, tasks, and explanations. That wasn't a coincidence. You weren't incapable of seeing it. You were simply guided to look elsewhere. Your attention was trained, shaped, and occupied long before you ever had the chance to question where it was going. So what mattered most stayed in the background, hiding in plain sight. And the unsettling part is this: it wasn't hidden because it was dangerous to know. It was hidden because once you notice it, you don't move through life the same way again. It's not an accident. It's by design. From the moment you were very young, your attention was pulled outward. Not gently, not by accident, but constantly. Bright colors, loud sounds, expectations, rules, screens, schedules. You were taught what to believe, what to want, how to behave, how to succeed. But almost no one ever stopped and said, "Notice yourself. Notice the one who is seeing all this." That omission matters more than it seems. You were given answers before you were taught how to look. You were trained to react before you were invited to observe. And over time, this became normal. Being busy felt like being alive. Thinking non-stop felt like intelligence. Doing more felt like worth. Meanwhile, the simple act of being present, of resting attention on your own inner experience, quietly disappeared from your life. This didn't happen randomly. A distracted mind is easier to guide. An attention that is always elsewhere doesn't question where it's being led. When your focus is constantly occupied with noise, comparison, urgency, and fear, you don't have the space to notice deeper patterns. You don't ask who benefits from your exhaustion. You don't feel how far you've drifted from yourself. So distraction became the default state. Look around. Everything competes for your attention, but very little nourishes it. News cycles designed to provoke emotion without resolution. Entertainment that never truly satisfies, only hooks. Work rhythms that reward constant output but ignore inner clarity. Even self-improvement is often framed as fixing yourself, not understanding yourself. The result is subtle but profound. You live in reaction mode. Something happens and your body tightens. A thought appears and you follow it automatically. An emotion rises and it defines your day. You move from moment to moment without ever fully arriving in any of them. And when you're living like that, you're absent from the most important place you could be, because your real power doesn't come from what you consume, produce, or prove. It comes from awareness, from the quiet capacity to notice what's happening without immediately being pulled into it, from seeing a thought as a thought, not as truth, from feeling an emotion without letting it dictate your next move. That capacity weakens when it's never exercised. No one needed to lock it away, they just needed to keep you busy, keep you slightly anxious, slightly behind, slightly unsure, always reaching for the next thing that promises relief or validation. In that state, you rarely stop long enough to notice the patterns shaping your life, and if you don't notice them, you can't interrupt them. Think about how rarely silence is offered to you without being filled, how often stillness is treated as laziness, how quickly discomfort is medicated, numbed, or explained away instead of observed. You weren't encouraged to sit with your inner world. You were encouraged to escape it. That's not because your inner world is dangerous. It's because it's revealing. When attention turns inward even briefly, something changes. You start to sense how many of your reactions are borrowed, how many fears aren't rooted in your direct experience, but in repetition. How much of your identity is built from expectations you never consciously chose. That kind of seeing creates distance, and distance creates choice. A system that runs on predictability doesn't benefit from too many people developing that kind of choice. It functions best when behavior is automated, when responses are habitual, when attention is fragmented, when people are present just enough to function, but not enough to question the frame they're operating within. So, you were taught to look everywhere, except the one place that would give you leverage. Over time, distraction stopped feeling imposed and started feeling normal. You might even feel uncomfortable when things slowed down. Restlessness in silence. An urge to reach for something, anything, to fill the gap. That urge isn't a flaw, it's a symptom of how deeply this conditioning runs. But the fact that you can notice it at all means something important. It means part of you was never fully distracted. Even now, as you read this, there may be a quiet recognition, a sense that this explains something you felt but couldn't name. That constant sense of being slightly out of alignment, slightly rushed, slightly disconnected from your own depth. That feeling isn't weakness. It's a signal, because distraction only works when it's complete. The moment you start to see it as a mechanism, it begins to lose its grip. You don't have to escape the world or reject everything around you. You only have to begin noticing how your attention is being pulled and what happens to you when it is. And that noticing leads to a more unsettling realization. Distraction wasn't just used on you, it was needed. Because a person who is fully present, who has access to their own observing consciousness, doesn't move through life on autopilot. They become harder to predict, harder to control, harder to fit neatly into systems that depend on unconscious participation. Which raises a deeper question, one that sits just beneath all of this. If your absence was so useful, what would your presence disrupt? When you begin to see how distraction works, another layer quietly reveals itself. It's not just that attention was pulled away. It's that your absence served a purpose, not your physical absence, but something more subtle and far more important. Your absence from yourself. A person who is not fully present is easier to manage, not because they are weak, but because they are predictable. They wake up and follow routines without questioning their origin. They react emotionally before they reflect. They accept explanations before examining their own experience. And most of all, they mistake movement for meaning. This is where the system breathes easily. A system of any kind doesn't survive on force alone. It survives on patterns, repetition, habits that run so smoothly they don't feel imposed. When people operate mostly on autopilot, the system doesn't need to convince them of anything new. It only needs to keep them from pausing long enough to notice what's already happening. Presence disrupts that. When someone is truly present, even briefly, something unpredictable enters the equation. They notice how a thought arises without permission. They feel how a reaction forms before they agree with it. They sense when an impulse isn't aligned with their deeper values. And in that moment of noticing, the automatic chain breaks. That break is small, but it's dangerous to anything that depends on unconscious participation. An awake observer doesn't move on pure impulse. They don't consume as easily, comply as quickly, or fear as reliably. They pause. They ask internal questions. They feel the difference between pressure and truth, and that makes them harder to steer without consent. So absence becomes useful, not by removing you from society, but by keeping you mentally elsewhere. In the future, in regret, in comparison, in worry, in endless analysis. Anywhere but here. Anywhere but inside the simple awareness that could see through the noise. You are encouraged to identify with roles rather than presence. Your job title, your productivity, your social image, your beliefs. These are easy to label, easy to measure, easy to reward or punish. Awareness itself is none of those things. It can't be quantified. It can't be standardized. It doesn't fit neatly into charts or narratives, and because it can't be controlled directly, it's often ignored, not attacked, not denied outright, just left out of the conversation entirely. Think about how often intelligence is defined as thinking faster, not seeing clearer. How success is framed as doing more, not perceiving more accurately. How emotional maturity is confused with suppression instead of awareness. All of this quietly reinforces the same message. Stay busy, stay identified, stay outward-facing, because a person who turns inward in a grounded way starts to notice contradictions. They notice when fear is being amplified beyond reality. They notice when urgency is manufactured. They notice when their own energy drops after certain interactions or information. They notice how often their consent is assumed rather than asked for. And once that noticing becomes stable, manipulation loses efficiency. This is why presence was never emphasized as a core skill, not in school, not in most workplaces, not even in many spiritual spaces, where presence is often replaced by belief systems, rituals, or identities. Anything that keeps attention fixed on an idea rather than the direct experience of awareness itself. Because beliefs can be inherited, presence cannot. You don't need to be told what to see when you're truly observing, and that autonomy is inconvenient. It creates individuals who respond instead of react, who sense misalignment before damage is done, who don't need constant external validation to know when something is off. From the system's perspective, that's instability. Not chaos, but independence, so absence becomes normalized, exhaustion is praised, overstimulation is marketed as entertainment, emotional numbness is mistaken for resilience. And the deeper intelligence of awareness is quietly sidelined, framed as impractical, unproductive, or unrealistic. Yet even within this, cracks appear. Moments when you suddenly feel unusually clear. A pause where the noise drops and something simple but solid remains. A sense that you are watching your life instead of being thrown around inside it. These moments don't come from outside permission. They arise naturally when attention briefly returns home. And when that happens, you might feel both grounded and uneasy at the same time. Grounded because something feels true. Uneasy because you sense how much of your life has been lived without this clarity. How many choices were made while you were mentally absent? How many reactions were mistaken for decisions? This is where the system's dependence on your absence becomes most obvious. Because once presence begins to stabilize, it doesn't ask for permission to expand. It naturally starts to question the filters you've been given, the emotional tones you were taught to see the world through, the assumptions that shaped your sense of what is possible, allowed, or safe. And that leads directly to the next realization. If your absence was so necessary, then the way you were taught to see reality itself may not have been clean. It may have been filtered, colored, adjusted just enough to keep you from seeing clearly. Not by changing reality, but by changing the lens you were given to look through. If your presence had to be reduced, the easiest way wasn't to block your vision completely. It was to distort it, to give you a lens that looked normal, even familiar, but was slightly dirty. Not enough to make you stop trusting it, just enough to blur what truly matters. You weren't taught to see the world as it is. You were taught to interpret it through emotional filters that weren't examined, only absorbed. Fear became a default setting. Scarcity felt like common sense. Guilt quietly shaped your decisions. Over time, these didn't feel imposed. They felt like reality itself. That's how a lens works. You forget it's there. From early on, you learned which emotions were acceptable and which were dangerous. Which thoughts made you responsible and which made you difficult. You learned to measure yourself against standards that constantly moved just out of reach. And every time you fell short, the explanation pointed inward. You're not enough yet, you're behind, you're missing something. That message sticks. When you look at life through that lens, everything takes on a certain tone. Opportunities feel risky before they feel possible. Rest feels undeserved. Stillness feels unproductive. Even joy carries a background tension, as if it might be taken away at any moment. But notice something important. None of that comes from direct observation. It comes from interpretation. Two people can live through the same event and experience entirely different realities. Not because reality changed, but because the lens did. One sees threat, the other sees information. One sees failure, the other sees feedback. The difference isn't intelligence, it's conditioning. And that conditioning didn't arrive as a single lesson. It arrived in repetition, small comments, subtle warnings, stories repeated until they felt obvious, news framed around danger, success framed around comparison, worth framed around performance. Over time, the lens accumulated smudges, each one minor on its own, but together enough to dull clarity. You start to assume the world is against you, or that you must constantly prove your right to exist. You assume mistakes define you. You assume uncertainty means danger. And because these assumptions live below conscious awareness, they quietly shape your behavior. You hesitate where you might explore. You comply where you might question. You distract yourself where you might feel. And the most effective part of this lens is that it feels personal. You think these are your fears, your doubts, your limitations. You don't question where they came from. You just work around them, manage them, medicate them, or push yourself harder in spite of them. But a clean lens feels different. Not optimistic, not naive, clear. Clarity doesn't remove difficulty. It removes distortion. It lets you see fear as a signal instead of a command. It lets you see scarcity as a condition, not an identity. It lets you see guilt as learned, not inherent. This is why cleaning the lens was never emphasized, because once you start questioning the emotional filters you were handed, you start to notice how selective they are, how certain possibilities were highlighted while others were minimized, how certain narratives were repeated while others were ignored. You begin to sense that what you call realistic might just be familiar. And familiarity is powerful. It keeps you loyal to patterns even when they hurt. It convinces you that discomfort is safer than the unknown. It makes you defend the very lens that limits you, because without it, you'd have to relearn how to see. That relearning is uncomfortable. It requires you to sit with uncertainty without immediately labeling it as danger, to feel emotions without assuming they define you, to pause before reacting, even when the old lens urges you to hurry, judge, or withdraw. This is where resistance often appears, not from the world, but from within. The dirty lens doesn't like being noticed. It whispers that you're overthinking, imagining things, making it more complicated than it needs to be. It urges you to return to what's familiar, even if familiar means constrained. But awareness has a way of spreading once it begins. You start catching small moments when the lens slips. A reaction that feels exaggerated, a fear that doesn't match the situation, a sense of heaviness that appears without a clear cause. These are clues, not problems, signs that the filter is visible enough to be questioned. And once you realize you're looking through something, you can no longer fully confuse it with reality. That realization creates a quiet gap, a space between what happens and how you interpret it. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because you're no longer blindly agreeing with the first story that appears, which leads to another unsettling truth. The lens didn't get dirty on its own, and the fact that it was never cleaned, never questioned, never even named, was not neutral. Silence around how you see was part of the conditioning itself. Once you begin to sense that the lens you were given is distorted, another question naturally arises. Why was this never discussed? Why was there so much instruction about what to think, what to achieve, what to avoid, and almost none about how to see? That absence wasn't accidental. Silence, in this case, carried a function. You were taught many skills: how to analyze, how to memorize, how to argue, how to perform under pressure. But no one sat you down and said, "Notice how your attention moves. Notice how thoughts appear. Notice how emotions rise and fall when you don't interfere." That kind of silence shapes a life more than any spoken rule. Because what is never named is rarely questioned. When observation isn't taught, reaction becomes the norm. When awareness isn't modeled, identification takes over. You assume you are your thoughts because no one showed you how to watch them. You assume emotions are commands because no one demonstrated how to feel without obeying. The silence around observation quietly pushes you into automatic living. And automatic living is efficient. A person who reacts instantly doesn't slow systems down. They respond as expected. They reinforce patterns by repeating them. They become carriers of the same assumptions they inherited, passing them on without examining them. No force is needed. Silence does the work. This is why the absence of guidance around awareness matters more than the presence of misinformation. You can correct false information. You can debate ideas. But if someone has never learned how to observe their own mind, they lack the internal space needed to evaluate anything deeply. Everything hits them at once, and reaction fills the gap. Silence trains speed. Observation trains depth. Think about how rarely you were encouraged to pause without purpose, to sit without improving, achieving, or fixing. Silence was usually framed as awkward, unproductive, or empty. If quiet appeared, it was quickly filled, with music, with screens, with commentary, with noise. Over time, that teaches you something subtle. Being alone with your awareness is unnecessary, maybe even uncomfortable. So when moments of stillness do arise, the impulse is to escape them, to reach outward, to distract, to do anything except stay with the raw experience of being present. And because no one named this skill as essential, you may have assumed the discomfort meant something was wrong with you. It wasn't. It was unfamiliarity. Observation is a muscle. If it's never used, it feels weak at first. Thoughts feel loud. Emotions feel overwhelming. The urge to intervene feels urgent. But with even a little practice, something shifts. The same thoughts arise, but they don't dominate. The same emotions appear, but they don't define the moment. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. And yet, this was left out of formal education, professional training, and even many therapeutic or spiritual settings. Not because it's unimportant, but because it doesn't produce immediate, measurable outcomes. It doesn't make you easier to categorize. It makes you more aware of the frame you're inside. Silence protects the frame. By never teaching observation, the system doesn't need to forbid it. It simply remains invisible. People go their entire lives believing thinking is the highest function available to them, never realizing that awareness precedes thought and can observe it. That misunderstanding keeps attention fused with mental noise. When attention is fused, it's easily captured, pulled by outrage, hooked by fear, drained by comparison. You don't choose where it goes, it's chosen for you. And because you've never been taught to watch attention itself, you assume this is just how the mind works. But that assumption only holds in silence. The moment someone experiences even a brief separation between awareness and thought, the silence breaks. They realize there is a stable point from which everything else can be seen, a point that isn't threatened by uncertainty, because it doesn't depend on control, a point that notices confusion without becoming confused. That discovery doesn't require belief, it requires attention, which is precisely why silence around attention was maintained. Not a loud conspiracy, not a secret meeting, just a shared omission, a cultural blind spot passed down because it keeps things running smoothly. Because teaching people how to observe would slow reaction, soften manipulation, and introduce choice where habit once ruled. You can see the effects of this silence everywhere. In conversations where people listen only to reply, in conflicts where emotions escalate before understanding appears, in lives driven by urgency with no clear direction, all of it traces back to a missing skill that was never named. And now, as that silence becomes noticeable, another truth begins to surface. If no one taught you how to observe, it means your attention has been moving without your conscious consent for a long time. And if attention is always moving, always pulled, always claimed, then the question isn't just who you are. It's where your attention has been going, and who has been benefiting from it. Once you start questioning where your attention has been going, you begin to touch something most conversations carefully avoid. Attention isn't just a mental function, it's a resource. And like any valuable resource, it shapes whatever it feeds. Very few people talk about this directly. They talk about time management, productivity, focus, motivation. But attention itself is rarely named as the core element behind all of it. Where your attention rests determines what grows in your inner world, and what grows inside you eventually shapes what you allow, what you tolerate, and what you pursue. Attention is not neutral. When you give sustained attention to fear, your nervous system adapts to threat. When you give sustained attention to comparison, your sense of self narrows. When you give sustained attention to urgency, your body forgets how to rest. None of this requires conscious agreement. Attention alone is enough. This is why so much effort goes into capturing it, not just through obvious distractions, but through emotional hooks. Outrage keeps attention locked. Anxiety keeps it scanning. Hope keeps it waiting. Even positivity can be used to hold attention in a future that never quite arrives. The content matters less than the grip it creates. And because attention feels like you, it's easy to miss when it's being guided. You think you're choosing what to focus on, but often your attention is reacting to stimulation before choice enters the picture. A headline pulls you, a notification interrupts you, a memory hijacks you, an imagined future tightens your chest. Each shift seems small, but over a day, over years, it adds up to a life lived mostly elsewhere. What no one explains is that attention is creative, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Whatever you consistently attend to becomes more detailed, more emotionally charged, more real to you. Neural pathways strengthen, emotional responses become quicker, perception adapts around the familiar focus. This is why two people can live in the same environment and experience completely different realities. One lives in constant alert, another in relative ease. One sees obstacles everywhere, another sees options. The difference isn't luck, it's where attention has been trained to settle. But training implies a trainer. If your attention had no value, no one would compete for it. There would be no need to fragment it, stimulate it, or exhaust it. The fact that it's constantly targeted tells you something important about its power. An attention that is scattered can't build coherence. An attention that is hijacked can't inquire. An attention that is exhausted can't sustain presence. It can only react to the loudest signal. And when reaction dominates, depth disappears. You may notice this in your own experience, how difficult it can be to stay with one simple sensation without reaching for thought. How quickly the mind jumps to interpretation. How restlessness appears the moment nothing demands your focus. This isn't because you lack discipline, it's because your attention has been conditioned to move constantly. Movement keeps it visible. Stillness lets it turn back on itself. When attention rests long enough to observe its own movement, something shifts. You begin to see the difference between what you choose to attend to and what captures you. That distinction is subtle, but it's the beginning of agency. Without it, attention serves whatever is most stimulating, not what is most true. This is why attention is rarely discussed in a way that emphasizes ownership. It's framed as something to optimize for performance, not something to protect for clarity. You're taught how to aim it at goals, but not how to reclaim it from noise. Because reclaimed attention starts asking different questions. Why does this provoke me so quickly? Why does this thought feel urgent? Why does my energy drop after certain inputs? Why do I feel more myself in some environments than others? These questions don't arise from thinking harder. They arise from attention slowing down enough to notice patterns. And patterns once seen can't be unseen. You might start to realize that much of what you've been attending to wasn't chosen consciously. It was suggested, reinforced, normalized. And once you see that, attention begins to withdraw on its own. Not forcefully, naturally, like a hand pulling back from a surface that's too hot. This withdrawal doesn't mean disengaging from life. It means engaging differently, with more selectivity, more sensitivity, more alignment. And as attention becomes less available to external capture, another layer comes into view. You start noticing that the strongest distractions don't always come from outside. Some of the most effective pulls happen internally, through thoughts that repeat automatically, emotions that arise without context, narratives that loop even when nothing is happening, which leads to a deeper recognition. The illusion you're waking up from isn't only built around you, it's also running through you. At some point it becomes impossible to place all the responsibility outside. You may have started by noticing the noise, the systems, the constant pull on your attention. But if you look honestly, you begin to see that the illusion doesn't end at the edge of the world. It continues inside you, not as a failure, as conditioning. The most effective illusion is the one that speaks in your own voice. Thoughts that feel personal, reactions that feel justified, emotions that feel like absolute truth. Because when the illusion is internal, it doesn't need to convince you. You defend it automatically. You might notice how a thought appears fully formed without warning, and your body reacts as if it were a fact. Tension rises. A narrative starts running. Plans are made. Judgments are formed. All before you've had a chance to observe what actually happened. That speed is not natural clarity. It's training. Over time, the mind learns which stories to tell first. Stories of threat, inadequacy, urgency, control. Not because they're accurate, but because they once served a purpose. Maybe they kept you safe. Maybe they helped you fit in. Maybe they earned approval. But what once protected you can quietly become a cage. And because these patterns live inside you, they feel intimate. You call them my personality, my anxiety, my way of thinking. You don't question them. You work around them. You build a life that accommodates their limitations. This is how the internal system mirrors the external one. Just as the world runs on routines and incentives, the inner world runs on habits and emotional reflexes. Certain thoughts trigger certain feelings trigger certain behaviors. The loop repeats until it feels inevitable, but inevitability is an illusion. The moment you observe a thought instead of following it, the loop weakens. The moment you feel an emotion without explaining it, without justifying it, without acting on it, something loosens. You realize the thought was an event, not an order. The emotion was energy, not identity. That realization doesn't come from fighting the mind. It comes from watching it. And yet, watching feels unfamiliar because you were trained to identify. To be inside every thought, every emotion, every reaction. Observation feels distant at first, almost cold. But it isn't. It's spacious. It gives you room to breathe inside your own experience. Without that room, the internal illusion stays convincing. You may believe you're choosing when you're repeating. You may believe you're responding when you're reacting. You may believe you're being realistic when you're actually being conditioned. The difference is subtle, and that subtlety is what keeps the illusion intact. Notice how often your inner dialogue uses absolute language. Always, never, everyone, no one. Notice how quickly it predicts outcomes, how confidently it explains motives, how rarely it admits uncertainty. This voice feels authoritative, but it rarely checks its own assumptions. It doesn't need to. It's been trusted for years. The internal system thrives on that trust. It keeps you moving along familiar paths. It warns you away from the unknown. It keeps attention looping around the same themes, the same worries, the same self-definitions, and because it's internal, it feels safer than the external world, even when it's limiting you. This is where many people stop. They see the illusion outside, but they protect the one inside. They challenge institutions, but never question their inner narrator. They distrust authority, but obey their own automatic thoughts without hesitation. But awakening doesn't stop at critique. It turns inward, gently, relentlessly. As you start observing the internal system, you may feel disoriented. If you're not your thoughts, then who are you? If emotions arise and pass, what remains? These questions aren't philosophical, they're experiential, and they can feel unsettling because they dissolve familiar anchors. The mind may respond by tightening its grip, more thinking, more analysis, more self-judgment. This is the system trying to reassert control, not out of malice, but out of habit. It doesn't know another way. But each moment of observation creates a small gap. In that gap, you experience something quiet and stable, a sense of being that doesn't argue, doesn't explain, doesn't rush. It simply notices. That presence doesn't belong to the internal system. It witnesses it. And once you recognize that presence, even faintly, the illusion loses its total authority. You begin to see that many of your struggles were not caused by life itself, but by unobserved reactions to life. That your suffering often came not from events, but from the stories layered on top of them. This doesn't mean the stories disappear. It means they're no longer invisible. And when the internal illusion starts to show cracks, another defense tends to appear. A subtle one. When patterns become noticeable, when coincidences emerge, when intuition sharpens, the system often responds not with force, but with doubt. A quiet suggestion that what you're noticing isn't real, isn't rational, isn't safe to trust. When the internal patterns start to loosen, something unexpected often happens. You begin to notice things that don't fit neatly into the old framework. Subtle connections, repeating themes, a quiet sense that certain moments are not random, and right there, almost immediately, another mechanism activates. Doubt. Not healthy questioning, but a specific kind of doubt aimed at anything that can't be easily measured or explained. A voice that says, "You're imagining things. You're reading too much into it. Be careful." This is how people lose touch with reality. That voice doesn't arrive by chance. It arrives to close a door that has just cracked open, because the invisible is where control weakens. You were taught to trust what can be counted, weighed, compared, what fits into graphs and language and clear categories. That kind of knowledge has value, but it's incomplete. Much of your actual experience of life doesn't happen in that domain. It happens in sensations, intuitions, timing, inner signals that arrive before words. These things are real, but they're subtle. And subtlety is easy to dismiss when you've been trained to prioritize certainty. So when you start sensing patterns, the internal system rushes to label them. Coincidence, projection, bias, wishful thinking. The labels sound reasonable, even responsible. But notice what they do. They shut down curiosity. Instead of asking, what am I noticing? You're encouraged to ask, how do I stop noticing this? Instead of staying with the experience, you're pushed back into explanation, analysis, dismissal. The moment passes, and the door quietly closes again. This is one of the most effective tricks because it uses intelligence against itself. You're not told to believe blindly. You're told to doubt selectively. To doubt anything that might lead you beyond the visible surface of things. To mistrust inner knowing unless it's validated externally. To assume meaning must be imposed, never discovered. Over time, this creates a split. You may sense something deeply, but you override it with logic that isn't actually neutral. It's logic trained within a specific frame, a frame that values control over coherence, predictability over depth, explanation over experience. So when life speaks softly, you don't listen. You ignore the feeling that a certain choice isn't aligned. You dismiss the quiet pull toward a different path. You rationalize away the sense that a conversation, a book, a moment arrived at exactly the right time. You tell yourself it's random, and you move on. And yet, the patterns keep appearing. Not to convince you of anything, but to be noticed. Patterns don't demand belief, they invite attention. They ask you to stay present long enough to see what's unfolding, instead of rushing to label it. But doubt, as it's been conditioned, doesn't wait. It jumps in early. It frames openness as danger. It suggests that trusting anything unseen is a weakness. And because no one wants to feel foolish or unstable, the invitation is often declined. This keeps the internal system intact. As long as you distrust the invisible, you remain anchored to what's already known. You stay loyal to existing explanations, even when they no longer match your lived experience. You may feel something is missing, but you can't name it without violating the rules you've been given. So you settle for partial understanding. You explain life instead of experiencing it fully. You analyze moments that were meant to be felt. You stay in your head while something more subtle tries to communicate through the body, through timing, through resonance. This doesn't require superstition. It requires honesty. Think about how often you've felt a quiet knowing before a decision, only to talk yourself out of it. How often you sensed a shift coming before it arrived. How often meaning revealed itself after the fact, when you stopped trying to control the narrative. Those experiences didn't come from belief, they came from attention. But attention to the invisible threatens systems built on surface agreement. It introduces a dimension that can't be standardized. One person's intuition doesn't look like another's. One person's pattern recognition doesn't follow a formula. That unpredictability is inconvenient. So doubt becomes a gatekeeper. It doesn't say, this is impossible. It says, don't go there. It uses caution as a cover. It frames curiosity as risk. And in doing so, it keeps awareness confined to what's already been approved. But once you notice this pattern, doubt loses some of its authority. You begin to see it as a reflex, not a conclusion, a learned response designed to keep experience within certain bounds. And with that recognition, you may feel a quiet shift, a willingness to stay a few seconds longer with what you sense, without rushing to explain it away. That's when another realization starts to form. The invisible was never meant to replace the visible. It was meant to complete it. And the moments you dismissed, the intuitions you ignored, the subtle signals you learned to silence were not random. They were signs. And many of them appeared long before now, quietly waiting to be acknowledged. If you look back honestly, you can probably remember moments that didn't quite fit the story you were living at the time. Small interruptions, quiet signals, things that tried to get your attention before you were ready to listen. They didn't arrive loudly. They rarely do. They showed up as feelings, impressions, subtle breaks in the routine. A dream that stayed with you longer than usual. A sudden sense of familiarity in a place you'd never been. An inner nudge to turn left instead of right. A sentence someone spoke that landed deeper than it should have. At the time, you may have shrugged them off, or you may have felt them strongly, only to explain them away later. That wasn't coincidence. But it also wasn't something mystical demanding belief. It was awareness trying to surface through the only channels available. Signs don't force themselves. They appear at the edge of attention. And if attention has been trained to dismiss anything that can't be justified immediately, those signs don't stand a chance. They pass by, noticed for a second, then buried under explanation. You were taught to trust what could be proven quickly, what could be repeated, what could be agreed upon by others. Anything that arrived quietly, personally, without external confirmation, was treated as unreliable. So when life spoke in a low voice, you learned to doubt it, and the doubt felt responsible. You told yourself you were being rational, grounded, mature. You didn't want to make decisions based on feelings or impressions. You wanted certainty, evidence, control. So when intuition showed up, you delayed. When timing felt meaningful, you dismissed it. When patterns began forming, you broke them apart before they could say anything. This didn't happen once, it happened over and over. Each time the message was the same. Don't trust what you can't explain. Don't linger with what doesn't fit. Move on. Stay efficient. Stay logical. Stay within the visible lines. Over time, this created a habit of self-interruption. You may have noticed it as a subtle hesitation, a moment where something inside you leaned forward, then quickly pulled back. A thought like, "That's probably nothing," arriving before curiosity had a chance to breathe. Eventually, you stopped noticing the pull altogether, not because it stopped happening, but because you stopped listening. And it's important to understand this wasn't just personal. It was reinforced. Cultural language rewarded dismissal. Social cues encouraged conformity. Professional environments favored certainty over sensitivity. Even conversations with well-meaning people often redirected you back to practicality when you touched something deeper. So ignoring the signs didn't feel like suppression, it felt like adaptation. But signs don't disappear when ignored. They change form. What begins as a gentle nudge can later appear as restlessness, as dissatisfaction without a clear cause, as a sense that you're living slightly off-center. You may have everything you were supposed to want, yet something feels unresolved. Not broken, just unfinished. That unfinished feeling is often misunderstood. People try to fix it with more stimulation, more achievement, more explanation. But it doesn't respond to that. Because it isn't a problem to solve. It's a signal that was never acknowledged. The signs were never meant to guide you to a belief system or a conclusion. They were meant to guide you back to yourself, to your capacity to notice, to your ability to stay present with what's emerging instead of rushing past it. But staying present requires trust, and trust in your own perception was slowly eroded. You learned to look outward for validation, to wait for permission, to rely on consensus. So when something meaningful happened internally, you postponed it until someone else confirmed it. And when no confirmation came, you let it fade. This creates a strange split. On one level, you sense that life has a kind of intelligence to it, that timing matters, that not everything is random. On another level, you feel obligated to deny that sense in order to stay grounded, accepted, sane. So you live in between. Not fully asleep, but not fully awake. Not disconnected, but not fully engaged. Aware enough to feel the tension, but not yet trusting yourself enough to follow it. And here's the part that's easy to miss. Some of the signs weren't just ignored. They were redirected, interpreted through the same dirty lens you were given. A feeling of misalignment was labeled as fear. A moment of clarity was dismissed as wishful thinking. A deep, intuitive no was reframed as resistance or laziness. The language you were taught didn't have room for subtle truth, so it translated everything into categories it could manage. Yet even now, as you reflect, you may notice that certain moments still stand out. They haven't lost their charge. They feel unfinished, as if they were waiting for a different kind of attention. Not belief, not action, just recognition. That recognition doesn't come from the mind trying harder. It comes from awareness slowing down enough to receive what was already there, which brings everything back to a simple but unsettling realization. The signs were never outside of you. They didn't come to save you or lead you somewhere distant. They were expressions of a capacity you already had, quietly signaling itself through experience. And if those signals were possible then, even through all the noise, distraction, and doubt, it means something important. The key was never hidden in the world. It was always operating inside your own consciousness, waiting for you to stop walking past it. What makes this realization unsettling is also what makes it simple. Nothing was ever missing. Nothing needed to be added. The key you were searching for was never outside your reach, never locked behind permission or knowledge. It was functioning the entire time, quietly, underneath everything else. Your consciousness never stopped observing. Even when you were distracted, something in you noticed the distraction. Even when you were lost in thought, something in you knew you were thinking. Even when fear took over, something in you was aware of the fear. That something was never damaged, never conditioned in the same way the mind was. It just wasn't trusted. You were taught to rely on thinking, deciding, planning, controlling. Consciousness, by contrast, does none of that. It doesn't push. It doesn't argue. It doesn't convince. It simply notices. And because it doesn't shout, it's easy to overlook. But availability doesn't require volume. This is where many people get confused. They assume access to consciousness means achieving a special state, silencing the mind completely, or changing who they are. But that's just another task for the system to turn into effort. Consciousness is already present before effort begins. You don't access it by doing more, you notice it by doing less. Right now there is awareness of these words, not the words themselves, but the fact that they're being read. That awareness isn't strained. It isn't trying. It's simply there. And it was there yesterday, and 10 years ago, and when you were a child before you had language for any of this. That continuity matters. Your identity has changed many times. Your beliefs have shifted. Your roles have come and gone. Your emotional patterns have evolved, but the capacity to notice experience has remained stable throughout all of it. That stability is what gives consciousness its quiet authority. And because it doesn't belong to the system of thoughts and reactions, it can observe that system without being trapped inside it. This is the part that changes everything. When you rest even briefly in that observing presence, you don't escape life. You meet it more directly. Thoughts still arise, but they're seen sooner. Emotions still move, but they don't overwhelm as easily. Decisions still happen, but they come with more space. Not certainty, space. And space is what was missing all along. Without space, everything feels urgent. Every thought demands attention. Every emotion feels final. Every story feels true. With space, experience becomes workable. You don't need to suppress anything. You don't need to fix yourself. You simply stop collapsing into every mental event as if it were you. This isn't detachment, it's clarity. And clarity doesn't come from information. It comes from orientation, from knowing where you're standing as experience unfolds. Consciousness is that standing place. Not an idea, not a belief, but a lived reference point. The system couldn't take this from you. It could only distract you from noticing it. That's why the key was always available. Not because it was generously offered, but because it couldn't be removed without removing you entirely. Awareness is not something you possess. It's what makes possession possible in the first place. Once this is seen, even faintly, certain things lose their grip. You begin to sense when you're about to react instead of respond. You notice the moment a thought tries to define you. You feel when attention is being pulled away from what actually matters. And none of this requires constant vigilance. It arises naturally from presence. Presence isn't effortful, it's economical. The mind may try to turn this into a method, a rule, a new identity. That's fine. That's what the mind does. But consciousness doesn't need to correct the mind. It just observes it doing what it does. Over time, that observation changes the relationship. You stop being managed by your inner system. You start managing your relationship to it. And this is why consciousness was never highlighted as power. Power sounds dramatic, control-based, external. Consciousness is quieter than that. It doesn't dominate. It reveals. It shows you what's happening without telling you what to do. But a person who can see clearly doesn't need to be told much. They begin to notice when a choice is aligned or not, when something costs more energy than it returns, when a belief tightens the body instead of opening it. These signals don't come from thinking harder. They come from awareness being allowed to do its job. This is also why there's no final arrival here. Consciousness doesn't deliver answers and stop. It continues to observe, moment by moment. It adapts. It refines perception. It doesn't promise certainty. It offers honesty. And honesty, while less comforting than belief, is far more stabilizing. As this stabilizes, something subtle shifts in how you move through the world. You stop searching for permission to trust your experience. You stop waiting for meaning to be handed to you. You become more comfortable with not knowing, because you're grounded in the knowing that precedes answers, and that groundedness changes how you engage with everything else, which brings the journey to a quiet threshold. Because once you recognize that the key was always present, the question is no longer whether access is possible. The question becomes what you do now that you're no longer walking past it without noticing. You didn't arrive here by accident, not because this was meant to happen in some dramatic way, but because something in you was paying attention when it mattered. This wasn't about learning a new idea. It was about recognizing something you already knew, but hadn't fully trusted yet. What you've been sensing all along is real enough to notice and subtle enough to miss. And now that you've seen it, even briefly, the invitation is simple. Don't rush past it again. The next time you feel that quiet pause inside, that moment where everything slows just a little, stay with it. Let awareness lead before habit does. If this reached you, write this sentence in the comments. I'm no longer walking past it. It's a small act, but it marks a real shift. And if this resonated with you, and you want to keep exploring this way of seeing, choose one of the videos on your screen now. Stay with what's unfolding.